The real story in the UK historically is just vast social inequality, and it's not an accident in the UK. It's systematised in the UK. It's formalised in the UK. It's cleaved by politicians. You don't want to essentialise someone from a working class background and say, because you come from this background, you must possess these beliefs and you must see these as the solutions. Obviously, Starmer has his talents, but if you're going to try and leverage your working classness, then what is your class analysis? Stop saying working people. Say working class people, because every time you say working people, what you're showing me is that you have also signed up to this purging of class from our language. Corbyn and Sultana in Scotland was just like people kind of disowning it as a bit of London drama. They were just like, let's get back to organising, let them get on with whatever drama they're having down there.
Darren McGarvey, thank you for coming in.
Pleasure.
I think this is going to sound like a bit watered down, but I really wanted to have you on, Joe, for a very long time. I mean, you're a prolific campaigner and documentarian. And do you know what, actually, let's start with we're going to talk about your book, Trauma Industrial Complex, but let's start actually with a bit of your campaigning, because I know that you're going to go out again about hunger. And I did actually read a piece from a couple of weeks ago, I think, about the sort of the shame that Scotland should feel that there are still hungry children. I mean, why have you got yourself involved in this campaign?
Well, any campaign I'll be involved in around class inequalities, it will be to draw attention not just to the very obvious immediate issues like, child hunger or educational inequality, which is pretty prevalent in Scotland, but just always trying to see it as an opportunity to tell that wider story. Because whether we're talking about inequalities in the labour market, or even whether, Gary's stuff on a wealth tax, often we break the topic of inequality into subgenres. Usually because we have to focus a lot on the specifics of things and parse out and debate different things. But the real story in the UK historically is just vast social inequality, and it's not an accident. In the UK, it's systematised. In the UK, it's formalised. In the UK, it's cleaved by politicians. So anytime you see some kind of deficit in terms of the distribution of opportunity between social classes, underneath that you see a political decision. It's not the kind of wobbly hand of the free market. It's not an accident. It's politicians knowing where their bread is buttered, and they know that they have to secure the expectations and support of electorally lucrative pockets of the population before any discussion about what the poor or the working class can even happen.
Do you think you've seen that with this Labour government?
Absolutely. And in a sense, they're acting according to the political landscape and the incentives that it produces. But I think where Starmer and co have a bit of explaining to do is that despite the less than ringing endorsement from the British electorate, our electoral system did produce for them a majority. And the question is, what have they done with that opportunity? Because they're not going to get another one. So they could have went a bit more balls to the wall. Instead, they're trying to court so many different electoral demographics that they just contradict themselves. And I think that this is best demonstrated in how insincere Labour politicians, the high-ranking ones, appear whenever they pop up in media. Farage doesn't have that problem because he has no power. He's not responsible for anything. He's an insurgent. So in this highly clinical, stage-managed environment, he seems authentic. And that in and of itself is tremendously endearing to apathetic voters before you even get into immigration.
I do want to talk about Farage with you, but I think I want to pick you up on that word that you've used, insincere, and the sort of the insincerity of Starmer, because it loops back in with the book that you've written here. You're talking about trauma and, the exploitation of trauma, the backstory that, arguably politicians use to get themselves into power. I mean, do you see that with Starmer? Because immediately I thought then of the campaign that was, well, put together by Morgan McSweeney, but obviously executed by Keir Starmer. He had this backstory of poverty. I think we all know the phrase, I grew up in a Pebble Dash semi. My dad was a toolmaker. Do you think that he exploited a backstory that is now not perhaps being, well, I suppose, I think the argument I'm trying to put together is, if you grew up in those conditions, why have you not sought to fix those conditions while you're in government?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things there. The first thing is, I think, obviously Starmer has his talents. I'm not the sort of person on the left who's just going to act like everyone who does things I don't agree with is an idiot. You don't get into the sort of positions in life that he got into by being stupid. But one of his talents certainly is not for storytelling. He's not great with the rhetoric. He doesn't have a lot of flair and style. Now, that shouldn't necessarily go against someone if they have a strong political antenna and they have a strong ideological grounding, and that doesn't mean that they're an ideologue, but they have a worldview, they have a vantage point from which they construe reality. I don't think Starmer necessarily has that, or if he does, it's not strong enough to overcome all of the forces around him that are trying to batter and shape him into a certain type of leader. Now, obviously, you don't want to essentialise someone from a working class background and say, because you come from this background, you must possess these beliefs and you must see these as the solutions and you must fight against this, this and this. I think that assumes a lot about working class people, and it projects a lot onto them that isn't necessarily fair. But if you're going to try and leverage your working classness, then what is your class analysis? Because if you're using that terminology to try and position yourself as a leader in a country that's really divided along class lines, then stop saying working people, say working class people. Because every time you say working people, what you're showing me is that you have also signed up to this purging of class from our language, which is something that really took place during the Blair years, but has continued. And that's partly why we get this massive cultural fold around issues like immigration, because we have no class analysis now. So a populist like Farage can say with a straight face, all of your problems are as a result of immigration, and people don't have the tools to analyse in any other way, because just that basic language of talking about class is gone from our language.
But talking about the working class as a homogenous group, that is dangerous, would you say?
Oh, absolutely. And this is something I'm always trying to communicate back to sections of the left, where there's contact with the community on the basis that sections of the community comply with, the ideological frameworks of whatever organisation or collective it is, so whether it's a trade union or it's something around social justice, there's sections of the left that have grassroots proximity to working classness. But also, as a result of those parameters, that excludes a lot of people, and they don't necessarily have contact with the diversity of opinion that's out there in working class communities. And also, I would say, the complexity of how people arrive at those points of view, particularly on an issue like immigration, which becomes too easy to characterise as being rooted only in sort of racist intent. I've written since 2016, I covered that in my first book, Poverty Safari, go into even more depth in the second book, Social Distance Between Us, about the difficulties that the left can get itself into with connecting with working class people when it's so used to speaking and playing to its own audience. And I think for a lot of people on the left, there's this kind of ideological superego where it's like, how does this sound to people who agree with me? How does this sound to the other people in the union, the other people in the action or whatever it is? And you see it even when the commentators come out and speak. They're not necessarily talking to the people that are still making up their minds. And so we kind of, when we essentialise working class people, then that's one of the risks that we select. We select the good working class group, and we communicate with them, and we don't work as hard to try and communicate with anything outside that.
That's really interesting. The people who are still making up their minds. So, this is a long-standing problem. I think that people have diagnosed with the left. You are either with the prevailing opinion or you're outside of it. And if you are someone who hasn't quite decided yet, then you are not part of that group anymore. You're excluded. I mean, how damaging can that be?
Well, it depends on what metrics you're charting, how damaging it is, because if you've got an in-group that's very pleased with your performance in whatever capacity, then you're not really recognising that. I think that the left has been really kind of on the margin of certainly the politics recently, to the extent that there's a kind of comfort. There's a comfort in that obscurity. It's something that we can relish in, because it's in that obscurity and that lack of contact with real responsibility and decisions that we would make having any real implications, that we can become completely indulged in our counterfactual fantasies and our following policy prescriptions and our economic theories, because these things will never have to be tested. And so there's a kind of paradox sometimes on the left, where there's an overconfidence which arises from no chance of being in power, no chance of ever having to take a decision that would actually have any implications for anyone. And I think, as much as the current political terrain frightens me in terms of just this kind of normalisation of what I would argue are kind of far right viewpoints, I think if there is one positive, it means that we need to sharpen up if we want to be able to communicate into that. We need to be willing to come out of a comfort zone and meet people and discuss with them, not necessarily to change their minds, but every time we communicate, there are people watching who haven't made up their minds, and we need to remember, rather than playing to the in-group, that the people who haven't made up their minds might be watching, and just how we conduct ourselves in debate can be enough to perk someone's ears up.
I think that the most glaringly obvious example of this right now is probably the infighting between the Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana camps while building your party. Do you think that's just sort of symptomatic of where the left is at the moment then? It is just sort of infighting and playing to the gallery rather than looking at the sort of the wider...
Splitting's just the story of the left.
Right.
That's it. And that's okay in a sense. If you have a broader view of what a left can do, often, and I think this was evident when Corbyn was in play a few years back, there was this idea that Corbyn, rather than being a force within the political terrain that could leverage or create a new left pole in politics that would pull a more centrist, right-leaning government a bit further left, there was this idea that Corbyn could get into power, which I think was always a kind of fantasy, because either what would happen is, he, in order for him to get into power, he would be moderated by establishment forces before he would ever be accepted. And just that process of being moderated would mean he would be excommunicated from the left, right? Or, as I thought Corbyn's leaning into what his talents are, I thought he functions much better as a campaigner. To his credit, he doesn't have that ruthless streak that often is required in a leadership position. He dithers around, he takes his time. And in this current landscape, especially with the media pressures and stuff like that, you need a different kind of skill set. And with the kind of Corbyn, Sultana, your party situation, I think what you have there is just another evidence, another example of the kind of morality play that can play out between different factions on the left, where they forget that every single thing they do is communicating something to the public, whether they like it or not. And unfortunately, that situation, I was surprised by the amount of people in grassroots communities who were expressing real anger about that. Although I think also, and I know this is a long-winded answer, but what I also noticed, particularly in Scotland, was just like people kind of disowning it as a bit of London drama, because it is a kind of London-centric thing. Corbyn and Sultana, they were just like, let's get back to organising, let them get on with whatever drama they're having down there. And that was a kind of surprising and positive effect of it.
That's interesting, because being in London and probably being too much in the London-centric bubble online, I hadn't actually noticed that at all.
Yeah.
But that would make total sense to me, because there has actually been, I'm thinking about the numbers of protests that I have been invited to cover in the past couple of weeks, and none of them have been in London.
Yeah.
They have been in Scotland, or actually like sort of Newcastle and Manchester area. You talked there about Corbyn sort of needing a different skill set, or he would have needed a different skill set when he was at the top. There's a line in your book which I can't stop thinking about, and this is probably in a very, I'm going to be honest, it's self-absorbed, I think it was. You said that it's time to make an exit from the hot take culture currently passing as informed commentary. Corbyn doesn't fit in, you argue, or he didn't make hay in this media landscape because we require everything. I'm now putting words in your mouth, but perhaps because we require everything in short sound bites, and that's the way to cut through in the current media landscape. So how do you bring a politician through? How do you make an exit from the hot take culture if the media landscape doesn't allow it?
It's not necessarily about the message having to be condensed into sound bites. I think that Corbyn, just by dint of his age and the world in the left that he emerged in, is just naturally not well equipped to deal with the current pressures. If you look at someone like Zach Polanski, who has not just emerged out of nowhere, obviously, but that's when you see him in media and you see him talking and debating, what you're seeing is someone who's sat down with a couple of other people and really done a proper inventory on what has gone wrong in terms of communication. So he's I think he's learned the lessons. This won't satisfy, the kind of Corbynite left, obviously, because of there'll be positions that he'll have that will just be fundamental deal breakers. But I don't think anyone can deny that aside from the policies that the Green Party in England are putting forward, and their emphasis and their understanding of being more class sensitive, which is something the Greens have always been rubbish at, because it's always been a very middle class, environmentally focused movement.
Yeah.
I think that in itself, you could see in Starmer's speech that he was talking a bit to the left in a way that maybe he didn't feel pressure to before, and that left pole can be constructed again, where we're not talking about a radical left party winning government, but we're talking about it broadening the parameters of acceptable debate, and that I think is sorely needed in this country.
Well, you think that Zach Polanski is doing that?
Oh, without doubt, he's doing that. I mean, he's doing pretty lengthy interviews, even on Sky News or whatever, and it'll be the first time in years anyone's heard anyone on television being that critical of the billionaire class and wealth hoarders, and even just using these terms. I think Starmer even used that term in his speech. He actually made reference. It wasn't an elaborate reference, and he didn't go into it in any depth, but even just him using that terminology shows something about how the parameters were shifting a little bit.
Did you say billionaire class?
Starmer made a reference to wealth hoarding.
Oh, okay, right, yeah.
In his conference speech.
I was in the room for that, and that's just, I think a lot of it kind of went over my head. I was trying to pay attention, but
how did it feel in the room? Because when I watched it on TV, I thought, right, okay, there's judging it on its own terms, obviously. I thought there's a bit of fight here. There's something has shifted. But did it feel like that in the room?
It was a very controlled room. And I think that that's the bit I couldn't stop looking at, rather than, which is why I was so distracted from the speech. There were sort of, the preamble was, there was around half an hour of handing out flags, and there was sort of like these ushers who were explaining to people when to fly them and that sort of thing. And so, do you know, when you sort of get overtaken by how contrived a situation is, that I actually couldn't concentrate properly. And I was also next to a huge group of the parliamentary party, and it was the MPs who were the sort of like proper Starmerites, you know, proper like at the altar of Starmerism, whatever that may be. And so it just, I sort of just felt a bit lost.
Yeah. I think that then our contrasting experiences obviously are really show how a certain image can be cultivated for the public that maybe is contradicted by the reality of it. I mean, we all know that that's partly what goes on in politics, but evidently with a few people getting kicked out of the conference as well, they were very, very frightened of anything derailing what was Starmer's 7 millionth reset since he came into government.
It was a much older crowd, I would say, as well, than the delegates who were at the speech. Well, when you go to the speech, you have tickets to go. It's not like a free-for-all for everyone who's at the conference, you know what I mean? And it was notable that the crowd was older. And I'm not to make a broad sweeping statement. We've really got off on a tangent here, sorry. But
okay.
you know, I normally, predictably, activists are younger. And I think they sort of mitigated any potential protest by saying we're going to have the older delegates in here today.
Yeah.
So it did feel rather contrived. I think let's go back to trauma, because that is actually where I should have opened the interview. So I apologise that I didn't. You talk a lot about the commodification of trauma, and there was the concept creep, that essentially the term has become so liquidated that it's lost all of its meaning. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, I take some time to try and elaborate on that, because I'm aware that I'm walking a fine line between being sensitive to trauma while acknowledging some hard truths around its commodification. And sometimes people don't walk that line. They veer very much on the dismissal of trauma, and anyone who says they've got trauma needs to pull their socks up and get on with it. That kind of emotionally obtuse Piers Morgan type approach to life. So I had to take time to try and really spell out what is meant with the various claims in the book. But the commodification of trauma arises combination of just normal incentives in a capitalist society. If something is of value, it can be commodified. If there's a demand for it, it can be supplied, and then that creates perverse incentives to play up certain things and underplay other things. Social media, if you try to get information about losing weight or stopping smoking, or dealing with some other kind of mental health issue, you usually have to spend maybe a good few months breaking through a wall of misinformation and advertising that is disguised as therapeutic guidance, and so it is with trauma. And this is because of algorithms and the sort of content that they prioritize, that gets more eyes on it, and naturally then content creators who might even begin from a place of just wanting to get information out there, share their story, or give their therapeutic take if they're a professional. Eventually the algorithm is going to, I mean, we both work in media. We know how this is. We know how the name of a video is really key to how many people are going to watch it. We know how the thumbnail, but we also know that these things are a construction and not necessarily completely like for like with the truth of a situation. When we start talking about trauma, though, that gets a bit more dangerous. So one of the ideas that arises out of that commodification of trauma is this notion that publicly disclosing the most traumatic event that's ever happened to you is an essential part of the healing journey, which is nonsensical. Telling your story is very important. Whether you do it publicly or not, that's another discussion. Disclosure's important. Your pain being witnessed accountability for that pain occurring. These are all essential parts of a healing process. But that idea that you just vomit it up on social media because you saw other people do it with complete detachment from the potential consequences for you or other people connected to you or your story, that's a situation that's very difficult, but also needs to be parsed out sensitively because people naturally, they naturally are going to be triggered if you say anything that might invalidate or be seen to invalidate their trauma. So I would say about a third of the book's word count is devoted to making sure the reader understands, look, I get this. I understand what trauma is. I've been there. I live with it. It's a bodily condition that the mind then creates a story for. And the story's not always true. So when you're telling the story, you might want to get a bit more insight into it before you do it on, GB News or a breakfast show or wherever.
Calling freelancers, small and mid-sized business owners. Tide's Instant Saver account offers up to 4% AER variable, flexible access, and competitive returns.
Unlike other options on the market, you won't need to hold your money with Tide for a fixed period. That means you'll have instant access and free withdrawals whenever you need it.
You can get started today with just £1, making it easy to start growing your business savings.
Want to know what you'll earn? Tide's clever calculator gives you a clear picture up front.
Our audience will receive £100 cashback when you deposit £5,000 within the first 30 days of opening your Tide Instant Saver account.
Use code JOE, that's JOE, JOE. New members receive an annual equivalent rate of up to 4% AER variable, free for 6 months. For the full offer, visit tide.co/Joe. T's and C's apply.
It's the altar of the algorithm, really, isn't it? It's people sacrificing themselves for a tech company to make a lot of money out of them. It's interesting because this long precedes, and you do go into this in the book, this long precedes really social media. I mean, obviously now it's all, long been commodified. You talk about your own experiences as a documentarian. There's also, I meet a lot of young journalists asking, how do I get into this field? And I'm, amongst the general advice I give, I always say, don't ever write a personal piece about yourself. Don't do the I was sexually assaulted when I was 14, long read in the Times, because they'll commission it and then they'll never commission you ever again.
Yeah.
But maybe you can go into sort of a little bit about your own experiences about why this is so, because you were a writer before you were a campaigner. Is that fair to say? That sort of you found yourself in the world of campaigning and your story almost preceded you as a writer.
Yeah, that's right. What I learned subconsciously was that any analysis that I might have about class, inequality, it seemed to land better with the public and with the kind of professional class and media if it was grounded in what's called lived experience now. And the lived experience is kind of rooted in feminist standpoint theory. It's the totally sensible idea that people who experience something may provide unique insight that people who have studied it academically will lack. But lived experience currently has become a kind of buzzword in the third sector. So people who have experienced something, it's the new must-have accessory to authenticate your organisation in the eyes of funders and government and all of these things. And in that process, what happens is that the public and even sometimes experts begins to mistake an individual subjective interpretation of an experience as some kind of understanding of an entire demographic who've been through it. So I say, I'm Darren, I'm an addict, I've been more or less clean or sober for 10 years. I grew up in an alcoholic home. My mum died when I was 36. All that stuff's gold dust, right? That's gold dust in a lived experience context. But if I go and do a TED talk, or if I go and speak to a charity, or I even go on the news, a lot of people will think that having listened to me, they understand every single person who's been through that.
Right.
But that's only one type of lived experience that's relevant. But unfortunately, that's the cheapest, easiest one to throw together. You could survey lived experiences at scale, which is partly what happened and fed into the Beveridge report that led to the creation of the welfare state. Hundreds of interviews conducted across the country, which means that no matter what your personal circumstances are, no matter your political beliefs, your sensitivities, if enough people are surveyed at a wide enough scale, themes will begin to emerge around which policy can be designed and implemented. But now people are coming to an understanding of very, very complicated issues just through a few prominent lived experience campaigners' subjective descriptions of their experiences. And if that's the kind of game that people end up getting into by telling their story publicly, then I can say with a certain degree of experience that your story will change as you recover, as you mature. And one day you might wish you could go back and retell it again, and you'll find yourself trapped in a portrait that you have created. And that's very much been my experience.
And the problem with the concept creep that you're talking about in here is that what you're sorry, I feel sort of like I don't mean to be talking down to you because I'm talking about your experience, which seems
It's
sort of
okay.
but you know, you're talking about extraordinarily serious issues, right? Your lived experience is extraordinarily different to what influencers are talking about, which is, say, a breakup, and they will talk about the trauma that they felt on the back of a breakup. Why do you think that concept creep, or where do you think that concept creep is leading us to?
Yeah. So we might as well get a ball on deck kind of definition of trauma. There are lots of different definitions out there, but essentially the legitimate ones land somewhere in the following ballpark, which is that trauma is an experience or a set of experiences or circumstances that overwhelms our capacity to cope on our own. It lingers in the body. Now, there'll be the people who dispute the kind of physiology and biology of that. But most people who have trauma, where they feel it first when it's triggered is in the body. And then the mind comes in to contextualise that or tell a story about that. So if your breakup happened because you discovered an infidelity, that's traumatising. That's very traumatising. That's one of the worst kinds of trauma that a person in a Western context can experience. And the reason it's so traumatising is because it fundamentally challenges your concept of reality, who you thought you were, who you thought people around you were. That's so shocking that your body, to protect you, locks all those feelings in. And anytime you're confronted with a situation that is vaguely reminiscent of that moment, it will alarm you because it thinks it needs to protect you. Now, there's a whole industry out there and a whole kind of subgenre of trauma discourse that says triggers need to be respected. People should be paying constant attention to their triggers. They should be managing the people and the environment around them in order for not to be triggered. Now, in the short term, yes, that might make sense. But in the long term, you have to teach your body and teach your nervous system, re-educate it that it's safe most of the time. And that means leaning in to the things that trigger you. It means breathing through. It means seeking sometimes professional guidance. But this is the key problem. With the collapse of public services and the length of time that people have to wait to speak to someone who might offer them insight, people invariably turn to social media. And it's a wild, wild west. And if you acquire an idea about trauma because it feels good or it's validating, which is not always good reasons to internalise an idea, then you could run for years with a misdiagnosis that you've given to yourself about your personality or your mental health. You could be applying labels to people around you who challenge you, labelling them as narcissists or borderline personality disorder. And essentially, you're living in an alternative reality while thinking that you're armed with the facts about yourself. And so the book, as well as offering a cultural critique of the trauma discourse, attempts to take the reader on a journey in terms of how they might put themselves back in the path of the truth if they've wandered off it.
It's like I could think of so many people in my life who have done something that is literally following those steps. You know, there was a very learned friend of mine pointed out that, you know, when he was in the depths of despair, you know, he would see a lot of campaigns online, which was tell a mate, or, you know, talk to your friends, or call the NHS, and he was like, I am doing all of those things. What now?
Yeah.
I'm on an 8-month waiting list.
Yeah.
So, you know, how does that help me in the short term?
Exactly. And this is what, you know, I've always made a strong argument for personal responsibility on a left wing context, right? Which is not an easy, which is not an easy post to strut on the left, right? Because we don't really deal with the individual and we don't really deal with personal responsibility. But I make that argument on a purely practical basis, and that is that if you're waiting for the state to provide the services that you deserve that are going to help you to get better, then you're on to plums, you know. So you're going to have to acquire the resilience to try and manage as much of your adversity as is within your capability. And what that usually looks like is getting linked into a community of some description, you know, that's situated around something positive. Human beings need connection, and that's where we can draw a kind of power from, even in poverty, even in difficulty. And I say this, I'm active in the recovery community. It's one of the most marginalised communities in the country, and that message that, you know, even in an unjust systemic context where politicians have abandoned you, you can still make progress. That's a powerful message, and it has a lot of utility. It's not just a kind of a refrain that I lean on from a privileged vantage point. It really does work, and a lot of people who are trying to manage trauma are trying to get to the bottom of it. They will be called upon to do some of the hard yards themselves, hopefully with people walking alongside them. But that kind of personal agency is absolutely key to getting through a situation like that.
I'm conscious of time, but I do really want to ask you what do you mean by the people who have suffered from addiction, they are the most marginalised of the community? What did you mean by that?
There's not a lot of sympathy out there for crackheads, is there? Heroin addicts. I mean, that's a minority that it still seems to be fair game to dehumanise. There's no one really advocating for them in politics either, which is partly one of the main ingredients of a drug death crisis. If you don't have people being advocated for, politicians aren't factoring them in to the decisions when the election's coming round, and that means over time, the services that might ameliorate some of the difficulties faced by this population in health, criminal justice, housing, education, they don't get looked at. You know, in Scotland, you're 17 or 18 times likelier to die a drug-related death if you grew up in a deprived postcode. So the link between poverty and that sort of addiction is clear. And yet, as the years roll on, then, you know, the problem continues to mutate. The figures are up one year, they're down another, but they're solidly the worst in Europe, and have been for a very long time. And that partly is a consequence of political abandonment, and that is the essence of marginalisation. And then that's before you even get into public opinion about it. I mean, we're still contesting whether addicts are a real biological class of people. We're still contesting, is it really an illness? Is it not just a lack of willpower? I mean, I know people who have had legs amputated as a result of intravenous drug use, and they've continued to inject. Where is the evidence that they have any willpower? Where is the evidence that they have any choice?
That's the Piers Morgan argument of just pull your bootstraps up.
The Peter
Just get
Hitchens,
on with
Piers
it.
Morgan argument. And you know, that pull your boots up, there's a place for that. But I tell you what, it's not. That place is not from a podcast studio or a news desk. or the column of a national daily newspaper with no proximity to the reality of what choice looks like. When your body and mind are addicted to a substance, and if you don't acquire it, you're going to enter into withdrawals that feel like emotional and physical torture. But even then, there is a place for agency and personal responsibility, but that call to action is best dispensed from someone who's lived it. And that's where lived experience can be really handy.
Well, if you want to read more about that, and you should, I'm going to link the book below. I'm going to link to the book, Trauma Industrial Complex. Darren McGarvey, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you.
Thanks to Tide and their instant savings account for sponsoring this week's podcast.
New members receive an annual equivalent rate of up to 4% AER variable.
Our audience will receive £100 cash back when you deposit £5,000 within the first 30 days of opening your Tide Instant Saver account.
Use code JOE. For the full offer, visit tide.co/Joe. T's and C's apply.